Hello, my name is Jonathan Hyam, and I'm the curator of music and recorded sound here at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, located at Lincoln Center. Welcome to Remote Links, a series of videos exploring the life and legacy of composer and artist Maryanne Amacher. The New York Public Library is proud to be home to Maryanne's archive, where it will be available to the public for years to come, free and open access. I'd like to introduce you today to Remote Links as a series that will be hosted by Bill Dietz and Amy Cimini, editors of Maryanne Amacher's selected writings and interviews. I'm thankful to Bill and Amy, Blank Forms, the publisher, as well as the Cervalvis Foundation, whom we partnered with on this series. Thank you and enjoy.
Welcome back to Remote Links. Today's guest is Roshanak Kheshti. Roshanak Kheshti is Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies and Affiliate Faculty in the Critical Gender Studies program at the University of California, San Diego, and Associate Editor of the Journal of Popular Music Studies. She's the author of Modernity's Ear, Listening to Race and Gender in World Music from NYU Press in 2015, and Switched on Bach in Bloomsbury Academics 33 and a Third series. She's currently completing her third book, tentatively titled We See with the Skin, Zora Neale Hurston's Synesthetic Hermeneutics, as well as a performance piece, Veil Manifesto, with Sarah Mamani. Her current scholarship has appeared in the Radical History Review, American Quarterly, Current Musicology, Feminist Media Histories, Hypatia, Feminist Studies, GLQ, Theater Survey, and Sounding Out.
Thank you, Bill. I met Roshi a few months before Modernity's Ear was published, and upon exchanging just a few words, I knew that I was in the presence of a challenging original theorist of sound, and also a dedicated musician rooted in her practice and its social world. Indeed, her work has been a beacon for scholars working between music and sound studies, ethnic studies, and critical gender studies. And she moves, not unlike Amacher, provocatively across analysis, narrative, and performance. In her first book, Modernity's Ear, Roshi reckons with desires and dynamics in listening that configure race and gender across what she calls the world music industrial complex. In a recent article published in Current Musicology, she challenges scholars and artists to locate sound amid divergences between community and sense. And in her recent work on Wendy Carlos, she meditates on historical, technological, and political inflections in gender and sound synthesis between Bach and Carlos's historical moments and our own. A vivid and vivacious dialogical thinker, Roshi asks questions about what sound is and what it can do that electrify, a term that I choose intentionally based on how it moves through her recent book, as a figuration that captures critical and historical prescience, mutual affectivity, the will to shapeshift, and one's movement into an altered state. In this spirit, I'm so happy that she will connect with Amacher's writing today.
Hello, Amy and Bill. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm very much excited to join you in this conversation and exploration, and I just want to say as an aside how exciting and thrilling it is to engage live and in real time with primary source materials, which is really not something that we're often invited to do. We often present very, very, very cooked ideas after having, sat with primary source materials for often years. And I'm sure the two of you, are a testament to that. And this book is a testament to that. I myself am very fresh to the passage that I'm going to read. And so I am going to propose some ideas, and I would love to get your thoughts on those ideas. So here we go. I'm reading from the section called Perceptual Geographies about the research design and creation. And this is from the chapter Rare and Unusual Atmospheres. In composing perceptual geographies, ways of hearing become as important in shaping an oral architecture as the acoustic information, such as frequencies, tone, colors, and rhythms. How certain sounds are to be perceived in an immersive sonic environment is as important as the sounds themselves. Ways of hearing, how we locate, sense, and feel sonic events, are the specific factors which characterize experience in immersive sonic environments. How we particularize acoustic information to construct distinct transformative experiences. What perceptual modes they trigger, when and how they will exist for the listener. Will certain sounds be locatable, seems miles away, feel close, pulsate vertically above our head, vibrate an elbow, suddenly appear in the space, dramatically disappear as though without a sound? Do we perceive the sound in the room, in our head, a great distance away? Do we experience all the three dimensions clearly at the same time? In the room, does the sound drift, float, fall like rain? Does it make such a clear shape in the air we seem to see it in front of our eyes? Is there no sound in the room at all, but we continue to hear after sound as our mind is processing sonic events perceived minutes ago? Do we experience sonic imaging very near, moving beside, outside and around, one ear only? Feel patterns as they, in fact, do originate and develop quite specifically inside, within our ears. And I'm reading the footnote number 3, see dynamic range, the head stretch, page 266. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment and comment. One of the ways that I'm very much drawn to these first 2 paragraphs that I've read is in my own interest in the history of recording studios and how recording studios in the US, but also around the world, were geographically placed to represent a particular sound that originates in a particular place. Okay, and so Amacher, I think, is picking up on the way that, you know, the music industry had been very much purveying in local sounds for most of the 20th century. But obviously she's going further. She's going to the locale of the body and the situatedness of the body. And sometimes, as we're about to see, she goes beyond the body and she takes the body into speculative locales. So I'm gonna read again. In rare and unusual atmospheres, sonic architectures will be defined primarily by multi-perceptual viewpoints, ways of hearing, and such specific physical characteristics that distinguish sound when traveling in different mediums and atmospheric conditions. For example, underwater in the ocean, inside the acoustic sands of the desert, on top of a high mountain. Rare and unusual atmospheres are virtual worlds we enter sonically, places we bring sounds into. Instead of listening to the sounds of a particular atmosphere to get a sense of being there, I'm proposing that we go further by importing other additional sounds into this virtual sonic world to be heard as if we are immersed in this environment. The adventure is in the transformation of the imported sounds by the particular acoustics of an atmosphere and their interactions with its native sounds. The discovery of completely new acoustic spaces developing between native and imported sonic events, some unlike any we have ever imagined. We enter a virtual world with the atmospheric modifier scores, interactive software scenarios that are designed to transform sonic events so that they sound as if perceived in specific environmental acoustic conditions unique to a particular atmosphere. We experience certain sounds as we would hear them in these atmospheres, for example, in the resonating microbubble environment permeating the surface layers of the ocean, or immersed in the deep oceanic background sounds, suffusing the ocean's depth. We simulate perceptually, project into these virtual sonic atmospheres ways of hearing, with the effect of actively extending perception into these environments. Being on a high mountaintop or roof of a skyscraper and listening to the sounds from the ground below us are very different auditory experiences than hearing these same sounds if we are on the ground and listening to them in the space around us. Footnote 4. My own vivid experience of this occurred on the roof of the Sears Tower in Chicago while researching remote microphone locations for an installation of City Links at the Museum of Contemporary Art. Hearing the traffic sounds below me was a complete surprise. The familiar sounds of traffic were no longer recognizable from this elevation. The sounds I heard were musical, a choral ambiance, more like a diffuse cloud of floating aural shapes, moving in many different patterns all at once at a great distance. I'm going to pause and comment here. So one of the interesting emphases that Amacher is placing in this particular segment that I'm reading from has to do with I mean, obviously she puts it as virtual reality, but it's beyond realism. She is speculating how to orchestrate a mode of perception, okay? And so that because it's based on speculation, of course, it's rooted in a kind of artifice or fantasy, right? So on the one hand, you know, it gives the impression of this kind of omniscient hyper modality of perception. But I think she makes clear that it is rooted in artifice and speculating upon these modes of perception. Okay, I'm going to continue reading. The activity of perception, making it available for observation and discovery, takes on a major role in the scenarios developing between native sounds and the imported sounds to be transformed by an atmosphere. We are accustomed to perceiving sounds in the air in nearby local environments where the ability to localize sound is modified by subtle degrees only. Hearing the same sounds when they are modified to sound as we would hear them underwater, from the top of a high mountain, or inside the acoustic sands of the desert are very different experiences. Dramatically different acoustic spaces result. Underwater, we are no longer able to localize sounds. Sounds that are familiar to us will not be recognizable underwater as the same sounds. Transformations that occur in timbre and perception of depth, localization, and spatial orientation result in unique sonic ambiances that differ depending on whether the sounds are heard near the ocean surface or in the deep, diffuse background sound permeating its depths. Footnote number 5. Even with a microphone which I placed on a window overlooking the water at the Battery Park Firehouse, from which I received live sound continuously for 6 months, I was amazed by what I heard during a New York celebration of tugboat horns. The boats were located in Brooklyn, and the sounds I heard traveling in water from that distance were not recognizable as foghorns, but sounded with a dramatically altered spectra, more like the ringing of incredibly large gongs. I'm just going to pause to comment for a moment here. So one of the one of the really interesting things that Amacher is doing here is noting the vitality of materials, so that, you know, the capacity for a medium like water to be an actor in her experience is really critically important here, rather than what we had previously, earlier in the 20th century, come to understand as the primacy of the human actor in the role of perception. And I really appreciate that. There's one more paragraph I'm going to read here. Some wonderful, surreal worlds can emerge, importing familiar sounds from our local environments to be transformed by the acoustics of an atmosphere. Will rap music in the depths of the ocean sound like the underwater drummers in New Stevenson's The Diamond Age? How would prehistoric Mozart sound if we simulated characteristics of the Precambrian atmosphere? How different is the sound of thunder on a mountaintop? The music of Beethoven traveling through the oceanic wave guide, sounding throughout the world's 5 oceans. What if thunder occurred underwater? So I think, not only am I drawn to this passage because of the very subjective and specific way that Amacher is situating orality and listening, but in particular, how she's narrating this idea of ways of hearing, which is something that I've been very, intrigued by in my own work. So, with her concern for ways of hearing, she's interested in how we locate, sense, and feel sonic events, with the expectation that there is no universal way of hearing, right? But that ways of hearing are extremely situated. And, one of the things that I was immediately reminded of after reading this passage is the work of the Forensic Architecture Group out of Goldsmiths College. And in particular, they have a project called Torture in Saydnaya Prison, where the group of speculative designers recreates the architecture of a secret Syrian prison through the experiences of the prisoners, exclusively through their ways of hearing, as Amacher has put it, right? So forensic architecture, which is this incredibly dynamic performance art practice, rooted in a kind of, human rights framework, I think is based on the same presuppositions of space, architecture, and sound as Amacher is promoting here in this early work. So I'll pause there and hand the mic over.
Thank you so much. I'm still trying to pull all these things together. It's wonderful to hear all these connections, and I love the reference to forensic architecture. And I think Maryanne would have loved. I mean, of course, it's incredibly heavy work, but I think she would have also appreciated it greatly had she lived to see it. I guess one thing that I'm trying to think about, and I was really curious about, is I think in your first comment when you were talking about the history of the recording studio and its connection to like notions of the local and sort of also notions of authenticity connected to that and things like that. I'm sort of interested in like if we think through Maryanne now as a sort of way of hearing, so to speak, and look back at that recording studio situation, what that does to that situation and all those different really loaded components there, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I had, you know, these moments of kind of high-fiving Maryanne as I was reading, because, you know, one of the ways that I've talked about the history of recording in the US specifically, but I do talk a little bit about, you know, the work that happened around the turn of the 20th century, where recording studios were popping up all over the world. So it was really in no way an innovation of the US, you know, the local recording studio. But, you know, when we take into consideration all the variables that she's really paying attention to, including the placement of the microphone, including the atmosphere, including the, you know, acoustics of the materials that are, you know, under consideration. All of those things have led me in my own work to really to think about recording more so as the recording of the recordist, rather than recording of the recorded. And I think that's what she's getting at in this segment that I've read, which is that, you know, ways of hearing become recorded themselves. And so in her case, she's, you know, trying to, you know, in a painterly way, deploy ways of hearing in a staging that she's imagining, you know, where she brings underwater hearing to the top of a skyscraper. But before we get to that painterly approach, we have to make the assumption that ways of hearing are you know, recordable themselves. And she is working with that assumption. And I very much, you know, make that same argument about the localization of these recording studios around the US, but certainly around the world, that what becomes recorded is ways of hearing.
Thank you so much, Roshi. Like Bill, I was also kind of writing furiously during your beautiful reading, and then also your remarks. I just absolutely love how you kind of drew out and really lingered with the kind of textures and modes of speculation that are taking place in this text. I think thinking about Amacher in like a macro sense really is asking oneself, how does speculation take place in a way that is like both like very situated, attuned to like existing literatures and in like speculative fiction, and also like profoundly embodied and recorded, as you note. One thing that's so striking about this text is how many of her kind of earlier projects it weaves together and reconfigures and like takes to quite a different place, right? In amidst the City Links projects, she'll often write about how a body carries the sound of its environment with a listener into new social and acoustic spaces. And so that is itself even a kind of long distance or virtual transport, etc. So I guess I don't know, I might maybe just ask you to like just keep spinning out some of these ideas about speculation upon modes of perception, and just think about maybe some other places that maybe goes for you.
I appreciate how you're pointing to Amacher's concern with, and this is a concern of other composers, who were her contemporaries, but I think that she's very much drawing attention to the body as a resonant chamber, right? So that the body has its own acoustic properties, and the body carries with it resonance, whether that's in the form of tinnitus or in the form of trauma or PTSD, which is trauma, of course, but perhaps even a song that is an earwig that bore its way into your brain. The body as a resonant chamber kind of carries the trace of its meanderings, its itineraries. And I think she's exploiting that here in her own, what I think could easily describe as her speculative design work, right? That she's, deploying these traces and residues in her compositions. And to me, it's interesting that she refers to that as virtual reality, right? And, it's something I haven't really had a chance to reflect on for too long, but I think, the capacity to cite all these differently situated in place and time bodily experiences in one composition. Of course, that's speculative and that's surreal and virtual, but nevertheless, it can also be surreal to walk around a library and have like a Britney Spears song stuck in your head. Like you can have similar types of annoying or less than successful experiences of these sort of bodily resonances in real time too. So I noted how you in the intro to this chapter addressed the fact that this project was never sort of launched, so to speak, or the composition was never completed, or the collaborators never collaborated. And I wonder what such a production would actually sound like, how it would be staged. Would it require virtual reality goggles and headphones? Could it be performed on a stage of some kind? That I think would be really interesting in light of what I was just talking about with regard to the forensic architecture group. That I think this work would really lend itself to speculative design in terms of, staging an immersive, interactive experience where these very situated and embodied forms ways of hearing were manifested in some way. And it would be really amazing to experience that if someone were to pick up, take the baton and continue to develop this. And of course, now that the primary source materials are available. That very well could happen.
You know, funnily, that you end on that note, I just have one last thought, but maybe it opens out into something interesting to talk about for a second. But I just noticed in the NASA like PR stuff for the current Mars exploration, Perseverance, whatever it's called, that one of the little, you know, what's the word? One of the little, I don't know, just kind of little PR things that they have on their website is a Mars atmosphere simulator, and you can upload your own sound, and then you can download it how it will sound on Mars, which is in a very literal sense an atmospheric modifier score, like Maryanne says, and yet in a certain sense, like as charming as that is, it's also so trivial, and obviously, or not obviously, but Maryanne's work was never trivial. And so I think that like in the direction that you're pointing to in like ways in which these ideas can be enacted, in my mind, there's also maybe something that has to do with pleasure here, in like the specificity of materiality, or like becoming aware of the materiality of ways of hearing, of your own perceptual apparatus, that I don't know, to do this seriously, or to do the adventure of transformation, or however she puts it, I don't know, it requires something more than just the sort of literal translation of like this NASA app.
Yeah, and I think, Roshi, you captured that really beautifully in your remarks about, quote, the vitality of materials, right? In relationship to Amacher's recollection of the night of the boat horns. And again, we'd like see that across her work, like again and again, whether it's fictional life forms or set pieces, projections, the like material substrate of buildings, etc. So I think this all kind of folds together in a way that's really interesting.
Yeah, and you know, I think that what her work begs, you know, a composer or anyone interpreting this archive to consider is, you know, what are the mechanisms through which that vitality can be allowed to resonate, and what are the mechanisms through which that vitality is sort of squelched? And, you know, I think thinking about a piece of software that simulates Mars's atmosphere, you know, of course, we're all just sort of immediately, you know, like that's got to be ridiculous, you know. I mean, fun to just play around with, but nevertheless, you know, ridiculous. And I think perhaps it's because we can't possibly simulate that vitality in, you know, in an algorithmic form. That's my opinion, very controversial, but, you know, I think the materiality itself is going to, you know, resonate, you know, with integrity, depending on the mechanism that's used. And, you know, yes, that's borderline, you know, fetishistic of me to sort of imagine that there are some ways of representing sound that are better than others. But yeah, that's a discriminating decision that all composers have made since the beginning of you know, music, that this instrument is going to serve better to manifest this affect than this other instrument, you know. So it's not that controversial. And I think, you know, the fact that she is, you know, making recordings on location, and doing these elaborate studies in atmospheric resonance, illustrates that, you know, the materials themselves matter a great deal here. And so that's why I'm still kind of scratching my head about, well, what, you know, how would this really be staged, or how would it be performed, you know, and I think I don't know, it would be really interesting to hear what you two have to say about that.
I don't know. Amy and I have been involved with these kind of speculative performative approaches to her work that we've done collectively with a group of collaborators and friends of hers where we've tried to engage in these things. But in a certain sense, I guess like part of the answer I think might come from her own work, like what she did in other cases. Like it was great, you know, it's so wonderful in these videos. As you can imagine, Amy and I are so close to these texts and we've pored over every word, but in that sense, we're also like too close. So we kind of like, I can't really read them anymore. But then to hear you read like the note about the night of the foghorn thing, like that clicked something in my head, because, you know, we have some recordings from that. And she used some of that material repeatedly, pretty much, I think, I don't know how much, but potentially throughout the rest of her life. And so there are some kind of actual examples of how she would have treated presenting a document of a materialized way of listening or something like that. And I think I love what you said, that you can't simulate vitality algorithmically. And I think that Maryanne's practice totally like agrees with that. Like there's a John Cage poem about her, and it's kind of like a bad poem, but there's a little insight in it which I think is nice, where he says something, I don't remember it exactly, but he says something along the lines of, she takes sort of like recorded dead material and brings it back to life. And I think that's actually kind of true, because she would, in a not to fetishize something analog, but she would take these recorded things and put them in lively relationships with us. That might mean putting the loudspeaker behind the wall and doing a little bit of EQ on it in a particular way so that it comes through the wall anew. Or just like really subtle changes of dynamics and things like this, like in a certain sense, like really playing these recordings in a like absolutely like musician-y kind of way. So I think that is one sort of answer.
Awesome. I'll just maybe add one, or add a tiny sidebar. You know, with this piece of writing and also some of the other unrealized projects from around this period. I mean, I feel I resonate with what Bill's saying. It's like there's such a thing as too close, right? But I often find it helpful to pause and like ask myself, like, well, what kind of project is this, right? And so it is something that to be realized for like people to experience, but it's also like a research method. It's also a kind of like really like a kind of intense first person like reflection on perception and embodiment. Even some of the episodes that you note in the sound in the footnotes, the Chicago case, she did some of the site research with students, and so it's a kind of like a teaching or kind of transmission, right? So I think when I think about like a question of realization, I'm kind of like, okay, how might one like kind of triangulate between all of the kind of modes of social presence and like pressure that are encapsulated in these projects. You know, there's also the, you know, it's like what technology, okay, fine. That's kind of lodged in there too. But I find myself, falling back on all these like layers of process and even collaboration, et cetera. And I guess for me, like even inhabiting like a small constellation within that vast, like out projected working process would be would be compelling and sort of challenging way to open up this question.
And you know, you both so beautifully remind me that, you know, this notion of vitality is also contained in this project that you're engaging in, right? Where the vitality of the recording is actually resonating right now through us, you know, even, and it's very speculative because I'm not listening to the recording, but I'm present with her embodied, you know, recording in the form of writing about those sounds. And so, you know, by all means, yes, absolutely. You know, performance outside of the proscenium is happening in the context of teaching. You know, it's happening in the context of you know, making instruments out of these recordings. It's happening in the context of an engagement with the archive that's dynamic and live. And so I think this is a really interesting and exciting way that you have organized us to become conduits to that vitality.